There are two elements that we've been discussing: the Aron, the ark, and the Kaporis, which is the cover on top of the ark that has the Keruvim, the angels on top. And we said that there are two opinions about whether they constitute a single entity, which is the view of the Ramban, or whether they're two completely separate parts of how we build the Mishkan, or two different elements of the Mishkan, which is the opinion of Rashi. And as promised, I said that we're going to look at why they have this difference of opinion, because it doesn't come out of nowhere. So clearly the Rashi and the Ramban have different views as to what the purpose is of the ark and the purpose of the Kaporah. So we'll start with the Ramban, because it's going to be, in a sense, easier. The Ramban has a view, as many of the medieval commentators have. What is the purpose of the Mishkan in the desert? And then by extension, what is the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash in Jerusalem many years later? So according to the Ramban, whatever the purpose is going to obviously be most expressed in one key part of that structure. And I will tell you what this is all about. So for example, just for comparison, the Rambam, so this, we shouldn't get confused between the Rambam Maimonides and Ramban Nachmanides. So the Rambam says that the whole purpose of having this place, the Mishkan and subsequently the Beis HaMikdash, is to have a place where you could serve Hashem, where you could bring sacrifices. Therefore, in his view, the most important part of the whole Beis HaMikdash is the altar, the Mizbech, because that's where you're going to bring these sacrifices. So that's obviously the most important part. The Ramban, which is relevant to our conversation, says that the entire purpose of the Mishkan is to have a place where the divine presence could be manifested. And that's why, in his view, the most important and central part of the whole structure, both the Mishkan and subsequently the Beis HaMikdash, is the Aron, is the ark, because what the ark is going to do, it's going to draw the divine presence into the world. And the reason it's going to draw the divine presence is because the ark contains everything that Judaism is all about. Inside the ark, you've got the tablets. The tablets are the core of the whole of the Jewish experience, the whole of the Torah. The purpose of the Torah is to bring godliness into the world. Therefore, in the ark, that's going to be, so to speak, the tuning fork that brings godliness into the world. And as a result of the fact that this is a place, or this is the element that brings godliness into the world, it follows naturally and logically that this is also going to be the place that Hashem is going to communicate through, which we see clearly in the Torah, that it says Hashem is going to speak to Moshe through the Keruvim. The sound would come out from between the Keruvim. So according to Ramban, that makes sense, because this is the element that brings godliness into the world. This is the element that represents the Torah, which is as we call it, Luchos Ha'edus, tablets of testimony, meaning to say that this illustrates to us that Hashem communicates to the Jewish people. He communicated the Torah, and now he communicates to Moshe through the course of the time that they're in the desert. So one element with one message, bringing godliness into the world. Rashi sees it differently. Rashi says there are two things happening over here. The one is that you have the ark, which contains the tablets inside it, and that is the eidos. That is the evidence to the fact that Hashem is with the Jewish people. So if you want to speak about manifesting godliness into the world, so that is, so to speak, the conduit that allows godliness to be in this world, because this is where the Torah lies. On the other hand, what sits on top of that is a broadcasting mechanism. It's like an amplifier that sits on top of it, and that's called the kaporos, the cover that has part of it, the keruvim, and that is there to allow Hashem to speak to us. Two separate messages. In other words, if you want to be even more technical, according to the Ramban, not only is the kaporos, the lid, part of the Aron, but even the keruvim, the shapes on top of the lid, which are the shapes of these two angelic figures, is actually part of the ark. According to Rashi, the kaporos is separate from the ark, and the two keruvim that sit on top of the ark, those are there to do a completely different role, which is to broadcast messages to Moshe.
Rabbi, so that lid was never ever removed.
It was removed to put the tablets in.
Then
That's
it was
it.
sealed.
Yeah. I wouldn't say sealed. It remains movable, but it stays where it is. So this is the core of understanding what the difference is between Rashi and the Ramban, is what is the purpose of either the one element as a whole, which is the Ramban's view, or two separate elements, which is Rashi's view. So we're now going to jump ahead, because there's a little bit more technical detail we could go into, but we're going to actually jump ahead and rather understand, well, what's the message for us? Because we started this conversation by saying what's most important. Is the most important thing the Jewish people, or is the most important thing the Torah? And there's another way that you could ask that question, and that is, do we have a relationship with Hashem because we have a relationship with Hashem? Or do we have a relationship with Hashem if we have the Torah in our lives? Now there's a very well-known quotation which says, Tlas kashrin miskashro'on da b'da. There are three knots that are linked to each other. What are the three knots? Yisrael be'oraisa. The Jewish people are connected to the Torah. V'oraisa b'kucha brichu. And the Torah is connected to Hashem. So that sounds very much like if you want to have a relationship or a meaningful bond with Hashem, you need the Torah to create that bridge, to create that connection. And that's, I think, how most people understand it, that until such time as we have the Torah guiding our lives, and until such time as we're living a life that is aligned with the Torah, we don't really have that meaningful connection to Hashem. But as we're about to discover, it's not as simple as that. And the reason it's not as simple as that is because you've got two commentators over here, and this is a perfect example of where you see, and this is how a person is supposed to learn Torah, where you see that there are two different opinions about a particular topic, so you naturally think, oh, they're obviously in disagreement. But that's not how the Torah works. The Torah is fundamentally a unified concept, because ultimately the Torah is Hashem's wisdom, and Hashem is one. So therefore, when you see two different opinions, and therefore you assume that there's some level of debate, what you really need to be looking for is how there are two different perspectives that complement each other, rather than the fact that there's a debate. And that's the correct way to learn Torah, is to always find the unifying factor within the Torah rather than the diversity within the Torah. And one thing that the Rebbe does always is finds and illustrates that unifying factor. So in order to get that, we need to understand the difference of the style of commentary of Rashi and the style of commentary of the Ramban, because we could very easily, and it would be appropriate, we could easily put them into a category that they belong to the same style of commentator. They are what's called Pashtanei HaMikra, which means that there are different kinds of commentaries who have different objectives. And the objective of Rashi is always to give us understanding of the most simple interpretation of what the Torah is telling us. Now the Ramban wants to do the same thing. Therefore he's called a Pashton. He's somebody who's looking to give us the simplest explanation of what the text is saying. Whereas there are other commentaries who don't focus on that. They focus on more allegorical messages or sometimes things that are not even illustrated in the pasuk. You've got to look beyond, but they're looking here for the pshat. However, the big difference between Rashi and the Ramban is that Rashi sticks very much to that approach right throughout all of his commentary, which is why Rashi is always very concise, because he's essentially just telling us simply this is what the verse is saying. If there's an issue that's a sticky issue, then Rashi will get into more detail in order to help us understand the simple understanding. The Ramban, on the other hand, mixes it up a little bit, and in addition to just telling us the simple explanation, if you're familiar with the Ramban, his commentary is usually a lot more elaborate, and he also brings other angles and perspectives over and above just the simple understanding. Now, we've got to understand what is the difference fundamentally, spiritually, philosophically. What's the difference between just sticking with the pshat and bringing in more elaborate insights? So what I'm sure everybody will appreciate from their own experience, the value of knowing simply what something means is that you get what it means. That's the value of simplicity. So if somebody's trying to convey a concept and they're able to keep it very simple, that means we're able to walk away from there getting the core of what that concept is all about. The value of being more elaborate and using illustrations or bringing other perspectives is that you make it a lot more interesting. It's much more interesting if you've got a whole lot of different angles and insights than if you were just being told this is what it is simply. So there's value in each of them. If I need to know practically either what I'm supposed to do or what something means, then I want simplicity. But if I want to be inspired and I want to walk out and say, sure, now that was interesting, then I want a little bit more than simplicity. Now in spiritual terms, we make a distinction between what we call the simple and what we call the revealed. So not necessarily the elaborate, but we call the revealed. And we say that anytime that more information or more insight is revealed or shared, the experience is always a lot more enjoyable. At the same time, the more detail you add, in a certain respect, you actually take away from the core message. And that's why you've got to be really careful when you're giving a speech or teaching somebody or explaining something. You've got to be really careful that when you start laying on different layers because you want it to sound inspiring or because you want to be really engaging, you have to be careful that you don't move away from your core message. And sometimes people get that wrong. They get so caught up in the illustrations and the parables and the jokes and whatever it is that they actually lose the core message. You know the story, of course, of the very famous rabbi, Jackie Mason, that all of his family were Rabbanim, and when he realized, in his words, he says, when there were more Gentiles than Jews coming to his droshes, he realized that maybe he had to move on and go to Broadway rather than stand up in shul. And that's the message, right? If you're starting to veer into other areas, it might be very beautiful for the recipient, but you might be losing your core message. Now, in Jewish spiritual terms, we understand that all spiritual things operate at these two levels. There's what we call the etzem, the essence of something, which is never elaborate and never exciting because it's the essence. Like, for example, in the human body, the same word that we use for essence is the same word that we use for bone. The skeleton of the human body is pretty important, but it's the least exciting part of a human being, right? Nobody says, oh, I met this person and there was such a skeleton. I've never seen a skeleton like it. It wouldn't make any sense. In the same way as if you had to go even further and deeper, if you had to look at a person's DNA, the DNA is extremely simple. It's extremely basic. I don't mean basic, it's highly complex, but it's not something that makes a person or a thing appealing. And very often in life, that's what we do. We have to dress things up to make them more appealing. That's what we call giloyim. So if you have etzem, you have the essence of something, which is absolute, and you have the giloyim, which are the things that are, in a sense, made for TV. The things that are made in order to allow us an experience that is a more exciting experience. Now we've got to ask ourselves, how do we live? Do we live at the level of our essence, or do we live at the level of what we call these giloyim? And the answer is going to be that we typically live at giloyim. In other words, for example, you look around the table at all the people around the table, you naturally associate things with that person that have nothing to do with the essence of who they are. It has to do with what meets the eye. So how a person looks, what kind of mind they have, because do they think like I think, or maybe the way that they think drives me nuts, I don't want to have anything to do with them, or maybe I listen to how they speak rather than what they say. So all of those things are the things that either attract us or repel us from a person. Is the person put together, clean, neat? Are they scruffy? Those are things. They're all giluyim, and they don't tell us what the essence of a person is. And if we're going to judge people just purely on those giluyim, very often we could miss the depth of who they are, because as we well know, very often people who present in a particular way, you don't really get to know who they are inside, and you could really lose out as a result, because people don't look the way that we expected. Now, in our relationship with Hashem, it's the same kind of thing. There are two ways in which we have a relationship with Hashem. There's the essence of our relationship, and then there's the experience of our relationship, which means that every one of us, at different times in our lives, will have different degrees of relationship with Hashem. Sometimes we'll be more inspired and more connected, and sometimes we'll feel a little bit spiritually adrift. Now, that ebb and flow, that's only relevant to the giloi, the expressed or experienced version of our relationship with Hashem. But in essence, if you had to go down to our spiritual DNA, there's a very consistent level of relationship with Hashem. Very, very consistent. Which means this: if I have to talk in simple terms, purely simple terms, because that's what the essence is, it's always very simple, then I'll say something like, a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. It's a simple truth. Can't escape it. Doesn't matter how hard a person tries. That story of the person who goes from the Haim and he goes to America, to the new country, and he becomes very successful there. But unfortunately, in the course of his material success, his Yiddishkeit slowly disappears. So eventually, after a number of years, he comes back to visit his parents back in the Alta Haim in Eastern Europe. And they say to him, what's life like in America? He says, listen, unfortunately, if you want to have a job in America, you can't keep Shabbos. It's just unfortunate. It's just the reality. Can't keep Shabbos anymore. And the reality is, if you want to be able to have business interactions with people, you have to be able to go eat in the restaurants, and you have to have them over, and this and that. It's not kosher food is just not possible. So Shabbos gone, kosher's gone, unfortunately. And so he goes through a list, one thing after the next about this. You can't do this anymore. Eventually, his mother says to him, "Yankel, you still have a bris." At the end of the day, a Jew is a Jew. There's certain things you can't undo. That's it. That's it. So the simple truth is, a Jew is a Jew. But once you get into the elaborate analysis, that's when you get all these factions. You're not from enough for me. I'm not going to eat in your home. This person doesn't really believe correctly. They don't really observe correctly. That's when you get into the world of Giloyim, the expressed or the experienced parts of who a person is. And that's where you start to say you could be more or less Jewish depending on how engaged you are or not engaged you are. Now, both of these have validity because you can't just live at your essence. You actually have to have a real, tangible experience of life. It's not good enough for a person to say, well, at the core, I'm a good person. Okay, but you've got to live like a good person. As everybody always says, the main thing is to be a mensch. So what does the average person say? I don't think I'm a bad person. Okay, that's true. Nobody, usually, unless they're not healthy, nobody thinks they're not a bad person. There's people running around the world today, screaming and waving flags of terrorist organizations who think they're not bad people. Because the self-assessment that a person has is that, in essence, I think I'm decent. It's not good enough. You actually have to live that essence. It's actually got to express in real time, in real experiences. So you can't say at the core I'm aligned with Judaism if I'm not actually practicing a single Jewish thing. Can't say at the core I'm a mensch if you're not behaving like a mensch. It's very obvious. So you need to have both. And that's why the two concepts complement each other. We need to understand who we are, and we need to translate who we are into how we behave. And these are the two perspectives that the Ramban and Rashi are offering within the story of the Ark. According to the Ramban, the Ark is a single entity. It's the Ark containing the Torah, on top of which there's a cover, which has the Keruvim, which becomes the mouthpiece through which Hashem communicates to the Jewish people. Therefore, the Ramban is saying, what's the message? If you want to have Hashem's communication, meaning if you want to have a relationship with Hashem, it cannot be separated from the Torah. It's just not possible. It's not possible. You can't invent another method. Imagine somebody is in a relationship and they tell the other person, this is what you should have to get or feel from me in order to feel loved. And you can't say that. I can't decide your love language. So I can't say to Hashem, I'm going to make a connection to you, but that connection is not going to be based in your Torah. It doesn't make any sense. So that's why the Ramban tells us very clearly that it has to be seen as a single entity. The Ark, which is the house of the Luchos, which represents the Torah, and the Kaporos, which has the Keruvim, which is the point of connection between us and Hashem, single entity. And what he's describing for us is the Giloi, the experience of Judaism. The experience of Judaism, whether I like it or not, is if I'm not engaged with my Judaism, I can't claim to have a Jewish connection. It's just not realistic. Rashi, on the other hand, comes from the perspective of the Pshat. Let's look at the simplest reality. The simplest reality is that Hashem and the Jewish people have an immutable connection. So even though your experience of that connection might be lacking, that doesn't mean the connection isn't there. So if a child is put up for adoption at 2 days old, and they never know who the birth parents are, that's never going to change the fact that their DNA is from those parents. Even though their experience is they have zero experience of relationship with those people, and therefore there's a massive chunk of their lives that is missing, and they might live their whole life with questions and with a vacuum. But that's not going to change the fact that fundamentally the simple truth is they share the same DNA. So in spite of the fact that a person may not behave the way that they should, they don't forge this connection with Hashem, the reality, the pshat, the simplest understanding of what does it mean to a Jew, connected to Hashem. Therefore Rashi says, there's an ark, and that's one element, and that's the ideal, and that's in the Holy of Holies, and that's what everybody should really aspire towards, which is to live with the Torah's guidance and with the Torah's values. And above the ark, this is critical information, above the ark, that implies that something which is even higher than the ark is the kaporos, this cover that has on top of it the two keruvim, which is the place of communication between Hashem and the Jewish people, illustrating that Hashem's connection with us and love for us and our connection to Hashem is something which is even greater than what the Torah could do, which is a fascinating thought. Now, if you go back to the quote that I mentioned earlier, that there are three knots that are bound together, if you think about it practically, it makes no sense to say there are three knots if there are three items. Three items only need two knots to connect them, right? So there's Israel, the Torah, and Hashem. So I need a knot between Israel and the Torah, and then a knot between the Torah and Hashem. Why does it say that there are three knots?
Because you need to close the loop.
If you want to close the loop, you don't need to close. But if you want to close the loop, right? If you want to close the loop, then you have to put a third knot. What does that third knot do? It creates a direct connection between the Jew and Hashem that doesn't rely on the Torah. And that's actually the message. There are two ways that we connect to Hashem. There's an absolute connection, which exists directly between us and Hashem. And then there is an experienced connection, which is created via the Torah to Hashem. Now, these are complementary perspectives, because on the one hand, I have to know who I am in essence, and I have to recognize that there's nothing in the world that could ever destroy that connection. And at the same time, I have to realize that I want to experience that connection, so therefore I need to do something about it, which requires the engagement with Torah. And that's the message over here. That's why the keruvim are designed to look like children. Right? We're told, even though there's a debate about this too, the Ramban goes from the perspective that the keruvim are supposed to look like the divine chariot, the vision that the prophet Yechezkel has of a divine chariot. He says that's what the keruvim are supposed to look like. Why? Because the divine chariot is about revealed manifestations of godliness. And the Ramban says that the whole purpose of the ark is to have a revealed experience of connection to Hashem. The Rashi, on the other hand, and this is how we understand the keruvim, Rashi, on the other hand, says the keruvim had to look like children. Why is that? Because the love that a parent has for a child is not dependent on who the child is or what talents they've shown. It's absolute. It's an unconditional love. And specifically a little child, a baby who hasn't yet begun to display their specific nachas causing elements. And so that's the message, according to Rashi's perspective, is that we have to focus primarily on the fact that our relationship with Hashem is like the relationship of a loving father to a child, where the child hasn't proven themselves yet, and yet the father loves them with this incredible intensity, as you do love a baby with incredible intensity. And then you bring in the Ramban's perspective to say, and how do you experience that? Well, for that you're going to need the Torah. And that's the message. What is the priority? The priority is the Jewish people. Jewish people are what Hashem loves more than anything else. The priority for a Jewish person is to have Torah in their life so that they can actually experience that.